Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several developments across the front line. There's some confirmation coming from the western parts of the Kursk region. In the northern outskirts of the Ukrainian incursion there's some back and forth and some inconsistent information. In the eastern parts there's some Russian advances in the Kupiansk direction and the Terny directions. There's a Ukrainian counterattack in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar, and then there's several Russian advances in the Kurakhove direction from the north, east, and south. Starting out in the southern direction, we see that the Russians have managed to capture half of Makarivka, kicking Ukrainians out to the outskirts of the settlement, contesting the forest lines to the east of the settlement and at the northern outskirts of it, with heavy fighting continuing along the Vremevsky Ledge area. Further northeast, the Russians are fighting along the southeastern parts of Kurakhove, with fighting continuing along the northwest of Konstantinivka. Taking a look at the fortified lines, we see there's some fortified positions the Russians are fighting over here in this direction. Following that, there will be no fortified positions until the north and the surrounding area around Ilinka. In the northwestern direction, the Russians are storming Dalnya, which is the settlement south of Kurakhove, cutting off the connection between the river line along the Konstantinivka direction and Kurakhove itself. This will cut off the main road and supply area. With the Russian forces in the southern direction as well, such an operation can cut off the Ukrainian forces east of the Uspinivka direction, cutting off several settlements and a lot of Ukrainian forces in the eastern direction. Mainly the units of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the 79th Air Assault Brigade. The Russians are also advancing further within Kurakhove itself, capturing some more residential areas in the eastern parts of the settlement and the eastern residential area. With this, fighting continues to improve the foothold and expand it further than what the Russians already control, and to enter the settlement itself. Moving further north, the Russians have captured the settlement of Vosnesenka and the remaining parts of Novoselidivka to flank the Ukrainian positions here north of Kurakhove. With this, the Russians are looking to gain control over Berezhsky and Nova Ilinka, here near Ilinka, where the Russians are also fighting within the settlement itself. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the northern parts. According to the latest reports, the dam located here in the Vovcha river line by the reservoir located north of Kurakhove has been blown. This means that the entire area here in the western parts will have a significant flooding following the rise of water going down from the reservoir and down the river line. This will flood all the settlements of Andriivka, Shevchenko, and the general area here to the west of Kurakhove. The reports so far suggest that the river line has been raised by 1.2 meters, which is not very significant. It will allow the water to enter into the settlements, but it will not flood them, and the majority of the fortified positions would be left untouched. So there's not going to be a significant harm to the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians, nor their ability to retreat or resupply through the highway west of Kurakhove or in Kurakhove itself. Instead, it will just be more difficult to cross over such a river line, and this will make it more difficult for the Russians to make a breakthrough here in the northwestern parts of Kurakhove. This means that the situation, as long as it is not a complete collapse of the dam and a complete flooding of the area, would actually be more beneficial to the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area. With the Russian capture of the settlements north of Kurakhove, they are able to continue advancing along the railways towards the Kurokhovka Reservoir, also allow the Russians to support the offensive operations near Sontsivka to push down towards Stary Terny and Shevchenko. The Russians are also continuing offensive operations southwest of Selidove, where they're pushing in the direction of Pushkina and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along north of Soria, and the direction of Ukrainka following that by the highway connecting between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove. In the northwest of Selidove, the Russians have captured the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and the intersection of the E50 highway, With this, the Russians can continue offensive operations along the southwest of Novorodivka to launch further offensive operations towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Pokrovsk, where we see that there are significant fortified positions in the area, which the Ukrainians make use of to hold back the Russian offensive operations. Further north, the Russians have been pushed back from the waist heap southeast of Stupushki. The Ukrainians managed to recapture it, regaining control over the heights, and the Russians remain fighting over the heights along the highway between Ivanivsky and Stupushki, where heavy fighting continues along the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. This is just to show that this is one of the areas where the Ukrainians prioritize their defensive capabilities and attempts to hold on Chasiv Yar as long as possible to prevent a Russian breakthrough in this section of the front line. Moving further north in the direction of Terny, the Russians managed to capture the further positions along the northern parts of the settlement, pushing the Ukrainians further back and further securing an additional supply line in and out of the settlement in the northern parts of Terny. So the fighting continues here as well. In the direction of Hlushkivka, the Russians are attacking the village from Kozinikivka following the capture of it. They're also advancing along the railway for a two-pronged attack here from the southern direction, both towards Hlushkivka and the forest patches along the Uska river line, as the fighting continues in this direction as well. In the Kursk region, there are several developments, but it is unclear exactly what has happened. In the direction of Darino, there is confirmation that the Russians have gained control over further parts of the settlement and are present within it, with this geolocated footage confirming this, and this shows that heavy fighting continues along this river line as well, where the Russians are looking to gain control over Darino, Nikolaevo Darino, and push towards Svetlikovo. In the eastern direction, the Russians are here attempting to gain control over Novaya Soroshina, where we see this geolocated footage confirming their presence in this direction as well. However, according to Syriac maps, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to recapture some of these positions and are now fighting near Orlovka. According to the reports, it seems that the Russians launched an armored assault and were fighting near Novaya Soroshina, as we see geolocated footage of their presence along the forest line, where they were looking to flank the Ukrainian positions in the forest patches to the northwest of Novaya Soroshina and connect with the two sides. But according to Syriac maps, the Ukrainians are now launching their own counterattacks in the direction of Orlovka. This means either the Russian forces were cut off or that their attack failed and the Ukrainians then responded with their own counterattack. It could also indicate that this counterattack took place before the Russian push, which then captured some of these settlements. So it's unclear exactly what the situation is, so I'll leave it as a gray zone until further confirmation arrives. In general, there is no sign that the Ukrainians are deciding on abandoning the Sucha direction or the incursion into the Kursk region in general, and this means that although they are spread thinly across the front line in the south and the east, there is no indication that they will abandon the Kursk direction in favor of it. So the Russians will likely continue their offensive operations and capture more and more territory as the Ukrainians struggle to adapt to the situation with the constant Russian offensive operations across the front line. According to Ukrainian reports from Zelensky and other government officials, they claim that the Russians have 50,000 soldiers in the Kursk region, including the North Korean soldiers, and that they are building up significant forces in the Zaporizhia direction, where they expect offensive operations to take place any day. So with this, there's reports of offensive operations starting in the Kursk direction towards Sumy and in the Zaporizhia direction, but neither of these have properly started yet. There is the wave 3 of limited Kursk counteroffensives by the Russians, and there is simply positional fighting in the Zaporizhia direction, as there has been for the past few months. So we see that in general, the main push of the Russians continues in the direction of Kurakhove, Velika Novosilka, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Liman direction and Kupiansk directions in the east, and the rest are simply secondary objectives. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching this. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.